Final Judgment, we're going to be taking a look back at last night's debate and what might be one of the worst answers to a debate question that I've ever seen. When I mean worst, I mean most lacking in information, comprehension about the world, about the policies that affect the world. And when I say worst, I mean in history. Hillary Clinton's 9/11 thing was pretty bad, but this is worse. And not just in the way that most responses don't actually answer the question and avoid the actual issue. He so clearly doesn't know what he's talking about that it is delicious. And here I am, of course, talking about Donald Trump, responding to a question from Hugh Hewitt. Kudos to Hugh Hewitt for once again being able to be subversive enough to just ask a question that seems reasonable that proves Donald Trump doesn't know the first thing about politics or history or the world or anything. So the question was, what's your priority among our nuclear triad? Now, really fast, just in case it's been a while since you were in a class about this, the nuclear triad is a brief way to summarize our nuclear capability. The triad being that we have ground-based or silo-based missiles that we can fire that have nuclear weapons. We have our submarines that can fire nuclear weapons. And we have our intercontinental bombers that can drop nuclear bombs. That's the three things that our nuclear capability rests on. That was a very quick summary of what it is. See if you see any of that in this long-winded response. So Donald Trump says, well, first of all, I think we need somebody, absolutely, that we can trust, who is totally responsible, who really knows what he or she is doing. That is so powerful and so important and so irrelevant to the question that you were just asked. It has nothing to do with what you're being asked about. It's so powerful that you could trust your leader. Way to go, Donald Trump. And, of course, you can't trust Hillary Clinton. You can't trust Barack Obama. You can trust him. Now, you can't trust him to know what the questioner is asking about. You can't trust him to have a good response. You can't trust him to actually even attempt to answer the question or to ask for more information. But you can trust him to divert your attention. One of the things that I'm frankly most proud of is that in 2003, 2004, I was totally against going into Iraq because you're going to destabilize the Middle East. I called it. I called it very strongly. And it was very important. He said important again. The man does not know 4 adjectives. But importantly there, he threw in some dates. And what's interesting about saying that you called it in 2003, 2004 is you actually called it in 2004 about a year into the actual invasion of Iraq. So hardly like a predictive genius in Donald Trump, that about a year into our invasion, he thought, you know what, this might have some bad consequences. But understand that he's saying that his understanding of that region was so special in comparison to the other politicians of the time that you should make him the commander-in-chief. And yet, he was very clear at that time that he was still going to support George W. Bush, despite the fact that in 2004, George W. Bush was still doubling and tripling down on the invasion of Iraq. So it was so important, but not important enough that you would support a different candidate, Donald Trump. He says, but we have, and now he's actually going to talk about nuclear weapons, so that's nice. But we have to be extremely vigilant and extremely careful when it comes to nuclear. Nuclear changes the whole ball game. You moron. You could have said nuclear weapons change the whole ball game. Nuclear proliferation changes the whole ball game. Nuclear capability changes the whole ball game. When it comes to nuclear, and in another section of the debate, he said, I'm going to be very tough on families. If your child spoke like this, you'd say, oh, no, hold on. We got to correct that if you're going to give this as some sort of speech or debate answer or anything like that. But for some reason, this 95-year-old man, it's perfectly acceptable when he talks like a particularly dim 5-year-old. That's fine. Frankly, I would have said, get out of Syria, get out, if we didn't have the power of weaponry today. Sarah Palin would be ashamed to speak like this. The power of weaponry today. And then, and this is amazing, I mean, I criticize constantly that he doesn't understand history. He says, the power is so massive that we can't just leave areas that 50 years ago or 75 years ago we wouldn't care. It was hand-to-hand combat. Well, that's another exciting inclusion of debates there, because what's great about 75 years ago is it's almost exactly when we dropped nuclear weapons on Japan. But he thinks that we were literally fighting with swords and spears at that time. He doesn't know anything about even the history of the deployment of nuclear weapons, let alone the escalating risk of nuclear proliferation, or what we need to do to combat it, or the fact that Syria is nowhere even close to getting nuclear weapons in God knows how many decades. He goes on to say, the biggest problem this world has today is not President Obama with global warming, which is good because you weren't asked about that, but feel free to blather about it, which is inconceivable. This is what he's saying. So what is inconceivable? That there will be global warming? You've admitted in the past that there's global warming. You don't even know your position on global warming, let alone on the nuclear triad, which you again still have not actually addressed. The biggest problem we have is nuclear, again, going back to that terminology, nuclear proliferation and having some maniacs. So good, he knows what that is. Having some madmen go out and get a nuclear weapon, that's, in my opinion, that is the single biggest problem that our country faces right now. But you were not asked what the biggest problem is. You asked which aspect of the nuclear triad you would focus on. Hugh Hewitt, who's a fairly detestable human being, actually has a follow-up question. Of the three legs of the triad, though, so do you have a priority? I want to go to Senator Rubio after that and ask him. Donald Trump. I think for me, nuclear is just the power. The devastation is very important to me, which would make kind of a cool haiku, but a terrible answer for a presidential contender to give in a debate. He doesn't know anything about nuclear weapons, about Syria, about foreign policy in general. And it's not July, man. It's not like, okay, well, I'm only a 65-year-old man who's been in the public eye. I can't be expected to know anything about foreign policy. You've been running for the presidency for months at this point. And not only can you just admit, okay, I'm not actually familiar with the nuclear triad, give me a brief explanation, and then I will tell you some common sense about it. He can't even do that. He just blathers on and on about the nuclear and climate change. And it's pathetic, and he is still the front runner by something like 20 to 25 points. I could go on about this. I want to give, again, some credit to Hugh Hewitt, and so we will leave this final judgment with Hugh Hewitt's perfectly appropriate response right here.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.